Boom. There we go. We are live. Everything went through. So sorry about that. We're still early, 7:52. Um,
That's true.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Front Door Show. This is the 8 o'clock show, the normal hour show that we do. Um, Today, I have a special guest in the house, Harv Roman. So Harv, how you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. I'm looking for you and I'm looking for your Facebook and I'm trying to share all this technology. This reminds me of the old WCYC where your first interview, he was talking about being wrapped up in aluminum foil in order to catch the radio station. That's kind of how I felt right now. I was like, wait a minute, I got to look for Angelo's page and I got to share it. So I got to make sure that it winds up on my page against people want to ask me goofy questions.
So obviously, Gringo's on here as well. Luis Segura's on here as well. So yeah, there's already people coming on, which is cool, you know.
Again, I'll leave it at that because if I keep clicking, I'll somehow eliminate you, and that would be bad.
That would be really bad. So this is going to be the. So you had mentioned that you had did this kind of flip the script with what's her name? What's her name?
Years ago, not even that long ago, 2012, Sandy Castillo of Latin Soul had the idea that since I was always interviewing the artist, that why couldn't the artist interview the radio guy? And we ended up doing it. And then she made it a big social media thing where she asked people to submit questions. And so she just was reading off questions that were submitted through social media. And then that became the whole Sandy Castillo of Latin Soul, flipping the script and interviewing Harv Roman. And that was the first time that kind of happened. I had been interviewed one other time for an online magazine. And I also, at one point, I used to allow people like Fast Forward and TKA to take over the WCYC studios, but they wouldn't interview me. We would just pretend that they kicked me out, and then they would take it over, and then I'd be pushing the buttons and playing the music, and they'd be working the mic, and that became the radio takeovers, which our friend Milana Gonzalez, Kyrie Cortines ended up borrowing the idea when she was at CRX because we were buddies back then.
Right. So yeah. So the obvious question is, I'm going to ask because I don't know your history. I know of your history, but I don't know your history. So why don't you give us your history of how you started in this business or started in as far as your life in this, doing what you're doing right now?
Well, it depends what you mean, because my life is, it's been a little bit of everything. But if we're talking about the radio and the DJ stuff, at one point back, I was just out of high school. And I was like the fourth DJ in a 4 DJ group, the WJRC Traveling Disco. That's how old it is. It was a traveling disco. It wasn't, it was a disco back in the day. And I was the fourth guy in that group. And then Tony Boom Boom Badea, who became my compay later in life, was the fourth DJ in his group. And I'm listening to this kid mix, and he was like 14 years old. And I'm saying, wait a minute, this kid is better than anybody I got. And he's better than anybody they got. And we ended up comparing notes one day at Northwest Hall, who we all know and love Northwest Hall. And then we decided that we would make a go of it. So here I am managing Tony Boom Boom Medea. And then we just started, and he was so much better than me. So he takes over the mixing. I do the mic work. I do the managing. I do the booking. And that's kind of how it started in terms of what we were doing in terms of the mixing stuff, the hosting stuff. The radio stuff was kind of interesting because Tony and I were doing a gig on 26th Street, and this goes back to probably 85 or 86. And then Vince Gomez, who was the director of the Little Village Boys and Girls Club, noticed us on 26th Street, and he says, there's a radio station in my Boys and Girls Club. And I'm like, no. And he said, no, you should go over there. So I did. I went over there and I met Harold Kopta, the late Harold Kopta, who was the station manager. And at the time, he brought me in to help during the mornings do office stuff. And then I would read the news and stuff like that. Kenny Jason at the time was his program director, and he was running this group called the Young Sounds, which was all of the, Mario Reyes and all of those guys. Kenny and I knew each other, but we were not working with each other. He actually was not very happy when he found out that I was doing some things on the air. This was on a Saturday morning where his guy, who ended up becoming pretty well known on WGCI, he was like sleeping in on Saturdays and he wasn't showing up. So Harold one day says, you know what? I'm going to give you these 4 hours. So he gave me the 4 hours that belonged to Kenny's guy. And then Kenny showed up in his full sheriff outfit and he had a showdown with Harold. And he basically said, it's either him or us. And then Harold shrugged his shoulders and said, do what you got to do. And which was interesting because I had known Kenny since his Zach's Bars day. When he was doing his DJ stuff, we used to work the same events. But bottom line is they lost their 4 hours. I got those 4 hours. They would lock up their music overnight. So I didn't have access to the music that Kenny's group, the Young Sounds, was using. So then I would pull, at the time I'm managing Tony. So I'm pulling stuff out from Tony's crate to program it during the time that I was doing Saturdays. But I only did like 15 minutes worth of Tony stuff. I did a half-hour alternative show, a vinyl concert, which was a rock show, an oldies show. I just did 4 different genres in those 4 hours, and I was using kids I went to school with to do it because I didn't, again, I wasn't part of the CYC crew, and they conveniently would lock the music up over the weekends for safety reasons. It wasn't that they didn't like me, it was safety reasons. So I wound up doing that for maybe a year. And then ironically enough, Kenny, when he left in 1987, he decided to name me as his replacement as a program director along with Pedro Rodriguez. So we were co-program directors for maybe another year. And then once Pedro left, I ended up taking over the whole thing, teaching the classes, programming the music and whatnot. And that's kind of sort of a short story in terms of what happened at CYC and why some people looked at me as the guy that was breaking freestyle back in the day, because that was what was in Tony's crate. And all the other stuff was locked up. So I'm pulling whatever Tony had was all Latin rhythm and freestyle at the time. I don't think they even called it freestyle. That's what I was playing, but I was playing it because the Young Sounds music was locked up. So it wasn't like I discovered a wonderful sound. I liked it, don't get me wrong. They all be Shannon, how could you not like it? But I was only playing it because the other stuff was locked up. And I said, okay, let's improvise. And it was a perfect storm because freestyle at the time, or Latin freestyle at the time, was a lot of relatable young Latin singers. And we're on 28th and Ridgeway in Little Village. So what do we have? We have an audience of young Latin kids that were looking for something to buy into. And they ended up buying into the music that I wound up programming and playing at WCYC. And of course, at the time, the artists were just coming in. So nobody knew who they were either. And I'm interviewing whoever. Charlie's feeding me people, but Toy's feeding me people. Every time they brought somebody in, here, give away tickets, here, do an interview. And then it became a thing. I interviewed Nelson Fast Forward Cruz probably in '87. Wow. And he the late and love, rest in peace, Nelson. He just passed away earlier this year. But we had such a good time on the interview, and then we became friends. He said, listen, when I get to New York, I'm going to tell everybody when they come to Chicago, they better do your show. And at the time, Nelson had stroke. Nelson was a very prominent producer, and he knew everybody who he needed to know. And that's what would happen. People would call or come in and say, Nelson says we need to interview on your show. And then I ended up becoming friends with the whole clique. And like I say, at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of freestyle getting played. And the fact that people could walk to the radio station to meet these artists, that was a benefit too, because I wouldn't lock the doors. I mean, we did a Judy Torres thing where like 75 people were in the hallways because she told them to come inside. It was weird. Right. It was a good time, but it was weird.
Was Sal already created Fever Records, or was this before Fever Records?
Oh no, this was Sal. When did I start doing stuff with Sal? It was like '89. So I started doing things with Sal Abatello maybe a year or two into me being at WCYC. And he likes to remind me that he allowed me to use his artists for WCYC fundraisers. I didn't have to pay for them. A plugger that has Coro and Fascination at the time. And he was trying to break market. They, again,
Yeah, yeah.
the Riv wasn't doing a whole lot and nobody else was doing anything. And so because I was interviewing his acts, he gave me his acts. We flew them in and that was it. And then it blew up from there.
So you were, but if I gather this correctly, East Coast, it was already established as far as that sound, freestyle, and so forth.
Yeah, because you're talking about TKA and the Cover Girls in
Right.
1986, and then before that, Alicia and Shannon and Naomi, they had put out stuff in 83, 84, 85. So the
Right.
sound was there. It got labeled in maybe 86. I took over. I started at CYC in late 85, but I didn't take over programming until 87.
Okay. So, but it wasn't called freestyle but 82, 83. It wasn't called freestyle, even though
No,
the sound was there.
it,
Yeah,
it, the only thing it was that it wasn't called disco because it was that
right,
backlash. Disco was
right,
fine.
right,
Disco was fun. Steve Dahl blew it up and nobody wanted to call it disco anymore. They didn't know what to call it. It was just dance music. It was good stuff. But no,
right.
at that time, it wasn't freestyle up until the Cover Girls TKA came along. So I call it pre-style with a P. And I say, well, if it's Alicia, that's pre-style. If it's Shannon, it's pre-style. If it's Naomi, it's pre-style. And then once 86 came along, then they blessed it as freestyle.
Well, do you think, since coming from you, Harv, and I'm going to bring this up, and probably you would know better. Do you think the label of freestyle came up because there was a label of house music already being established here in Chicago? Or was it something we created freestyle, the term, or was that something that came out of New York that came out?
No, the New Yorkers would tell me that they called it freestyle because of the way you would dance to it. You're
Okay,
dancing in a freestyle fashion. It wasn't pre-planned kid and play stuff. It was fun music to dance to. And at the time they called it Latin freestyle because it was all the Latin kids that were put it out. And then eventually the Latin freestyle kind of got dropped and it got stuck with freestyle. But the people that I would talk to in New York, they were saying, oh, we called it freestyle just because of the way they danced to the music. It had nothing to do with and some people called it Latin hip hop, but they didn't. Latin hip hop ended up kind of dying away because there was already hip hop, and so they didn't want it to be confused.
Right. So I mean that's what I say, because I wasn't sure how that coalition for Chicago compared to New York, and I know at that time,
Well,
me and you talked.
Chicago was goofy because back then you would go to the Mega Mall and you would get these cassette tapes, and the Northsiders were calling it heartthrob for some reason. And I never called it heartthrob. We're on the South Side. We're calling it freestyle because that's what the New Yorkers told me they were calling it. The Northsiders are calling it heartthrob. And then you would have these little factions of heartthrob versus freestyle. It was the same thing. The only difference is we had a personal attachment to the artist on the South Side that the North Side didn't yet have. And ooh, we discovered heartthrob. Okay, you can call it heartthrob as you want, but heartthrob as a genre, it was freestyle, and heartthrob didn't really last too long.
I mean, let's look at what was being sung in the song. It was a lot of heartbreak. It was like that's why they were calling it heartthrob. Maria, all this stuff. So it seemed like one of the songs is all about heartbreak and breaking your heart, and it was.
That's probably what the North Side thought, but we never called it heartthrob when I was on the South Side. And this is funny because I was on the North Side living and working, and I was running the station on the South Side, and I'd come here to the North Side where I'm at now, and I'm like, why do they call it heartthrob? I don't get it. But you're right, it's all love music. You're either winning somebody's heart or somebody's breaking your heart. So I guess it makes sense. I just never bought into that term.
Right. So you're interviewing these artists. You're bringing. Was there any other radio stations technically doing this though in Chicago?
Well, there was, in that Milana Gonzalez used to be a part of WCYC. When she went to Columbia College, she started working as Carrie Cortinez on WCRX. but she was
Okay.
ours as Milana Gonzalez, her real name. Well, eventually WCRX says you can't do both radio stations. So she stuck with CRX as Carrie Cortinez. And then she started doing on her shows what we were doing the whole time at WCYC. So eventually
Okay.
Carrie or Milana ended up bringing freestyle to WCRX, and that's how that happened there. If there's another narrative, it's probably wrong because they weren't really playing it before Milana got there.
Okay. I mean, that's fair. The but you were interviewing not just freestyle artists. You were interviewing pretty much anybody in the dance community, correct?
It was a lot of freestyle acts, but anybody that was Chicago, I wanted to interview. Anybody
Okay.
that was young, I wanted to interview. Anybody that needed a mic, I wanted to interview because I knew that nobody else was doing it. I knew that they weren't getting opportunities, and that was one of the reasons why they would, call me for the interviews. Um, they thought that my style of interviewing at the time was getting to know the artist. It's not just you go to broadcasting school and they give you 10 questions that you have to ask. I'm asking their questions and then I'm listening to their answers and then I'm following up on their answers. And my style turned out to be a decent style because they enjoy that we were having conversations. It wasn't they do the same interviews now. You go to all the late night talk shows, it's always the same questions. What are you promoting? And let's talk about that. My interviews have always been a conversation, and I would always kind of look for something that they might have in common with the listener and then talk about that. So it wasn't always the music. It could be Cynthia's group having their coat stolen and then they're talking about our coats are gone, our quilts are gone, or George before he became Lamont talking about what his name was, but then Columbia made him change his name. These are things that people they wouldn't readily talk about with other people, which was interesting. But with me, there was either a comfort level or my style became something that they bought into and they just everything went with the flow. I really wasn't restricted in terms of what I could ask. And I didn't always stick to the business in terms of my interviews. It's too formula to stick to the business. You don't want your interviews to sound like everybody else's interviews. 1 2 1 2. Are you froze?
Yeah.
Yep. Ladies and
Okay.
gentlemen.
I'm back.
Okay, you're like
Yeah,
a
I'm
screen.
back.
You look like a screen grab for a minute.
You had guys working there with you, right? You had guys taking classes, or what were you
Oh,
actually doing?
well, yeah. Well, WCYC was a youth operated radio. Or it was supposed to be a youth operated radio station. And so what we would do is initially it was kids from the Boys and Girls Club taking classes and then getting rewarded with shows on WCYC. So it really was young people. My youngest kids were formerly 14 years old. And then I had a couple that lied their age. So I'm teaching kids that are like 13 radio classes, but they should have been 14 to begin with. And that's what it was. It was initially the kids from the Boys and Girls Club. Then we would go on the air and say, we're looking for students. And then whoever might be listening, they're a fan of WCYC. And all of a sudden they want to be on CYC. And then we had a connection somehow at the Columbia School of Broadcasting. I still don't remember how that happened, but then they would send me kids because they didn't have a radio station. So you would go to Columbia School of Broadcasting, you'd get taught, you'd get your certificate, but you didn't have anywhere to go to do radio. So I got people like Rick Party before he was Rick Party, who came to me from the Columbia School of Broadcasting, took some, in Rick's case, it was very generic classes. Rick was good from day one. He likes to tell everybody I was his first program director. I was his first boss, but he got in there. He must have been maybe 18 years old. And I brought him in and I listened to him. I says, I don't got to touch that guy. Here's the board. Here's some technical stuff. And he went on to be the most famous WCYC alum that I can think of, but I really didn't have to teach him. Now with some of these kids, yeah, you're teaching them from day one. And then you're watching them progress, which is always, Pablo was one of those that you interviewed Pablo earlier. Pablo was kind of interesting because he didn't want to do radio, but he didn't have the formal training. But what Pablo had was this wild and crazy personality, and he would do voices, and he'd scream and he'd yell and he'd screech and he'd do some weird stuff, and he was playing stuff that nobody else was playing. So to me, it worked out perfectly. I don't think Pablo wanted to do it to begin with because he wasn't trained. But I'm like, no, just be Pablo, and he was Pablo, and
Right.
the rest is Pablo history.
Well, do you find that people who become radio personalities, because there's a little different between somebody who's doing the programming and they're doing music and somebody who's a radio personality. You actually are talking on the radio. Did you find people who had the quirkiness, I guess, if you want to say, then they became more interesting on voice?
There were some. I had one girl. Well, there's a couple I could talk about. I won't name their names because you never know. But I had one that was so shy, and I couldn't teach her to talk to the microphone. She kept thinking that there's so many people listening, and she would get nervous. It's like, man, so I'm trying to say, well, talk to the mic, just talk to the mic. Don't worry about who's listening. She couldn't even do that. So one day I suggested that she bring a stuffed animal and put it in front of the microphone. And then she starts talking to the stuffed animal, and that's it. She became really, really good. Then I had another one. Again, she shall remain nameless. She she would flirt with the mic like you wouldn't believe. She would do it standing up. She would get all breathy. She would change her voice. This was before all those 1-800 numbers. Back then, you could have did a 1-800 number with the way she sounded. And she ended up developing a following because of the way she sounded. And that's interesting thing too, that when I think about that, we had a lot of girls and young women on the show, and we had a huge following at the jail because they're on 26th in California, we're on 28th and Ridgeway. And part of it was, Irene Mojica used to tell the story about how she would get letters, and these guys would say, I can't wait to come out and meet you, and that would freak her out. But then we also, like, I would get letters from the jail where people would ask me to dedicate songs to their wife that they hadn't seen, the kid they hadn't seen. It was interesting. It was interesting. Part of that whole 26th Street jail thing was when I got there, I also forbade the kids from the broadcasters from using nicknames. And you couldn't say shout out the 26th and whatever, 31st and whatever, because I quickly found out, even though I was from the north side, I quickly found out if you shout out to 31st and Kedvale, for instance, there's a gang there. And then if you shout out 26th in Central, there's a gang there. So I said, nope, you can say the name. You can't say a nickname. You can't say the corner. You might say the high school or the grammar school, but you couldn't do, because it was a little wild for a little while where they thought that we were, well, the Tribune did a really good job of it. One day, 1988, the Chicago Tribune comes out and they want to do a feature on WCYC as a youth operating radio station. And like the very first line of the article by Marla Donato, you can look it up, it says, in the middle of gangland. And then they started talking.
Oh my God.
So yeah,
wow.
that's how she started her article. And this was Chicago Tribune, not a rinky dink operation. And
Wow.
there were people that thought that about us. I had a potential student show up one day, and he was wearing the colors of the neighborhood. And I knew what the colors of the neighborhood was. I did youth work. I ain't that dumb. And so I made his classes a little harder than everybody else's, because my thought was, if I put this guy on the air, he's going to gangbang on the air. And so I made him work hard enough that he quit. And so I didn't have to worry about him being on the air. WCYC was great, and at times it wasn't as great, because there were times that the jocks used it for more than radio shows, and I would end up having the parents that would come in and complain about, their daughter called somebody at whatever night, whatever time, or there were some of the jocks that went to visit listeners. Heck, I had a freestyle act who shall remain nameless. And he did a thing where he did a limo giveaway. I got a limo. Whoever the caller is wins a limo ride. And So he winds up taking the limo from 28th and Ridgeway to wherever. And it turned out that the winner was like 15 years old and her dad was there. And
Ooh,
so the artist apologized, said he didn't know, he was sorry, it was just a radio promotion, and they drove off without picking up the teenager. And the bad news is at that time, there were some people that thought that it was a good thing to use the radio to pick up girls. It wasn't that song that they were talking about earlier, how to pick up girls, learn to dance. It was how to pick up girls, go
right.
on the radio and let them call you and flirt. And I had rules against that kind of stuff, but you can't monitor it 24 hours a day. Um,
Right.
what I did start to do is I started using my VCR to record the shows when I wasn't around. I had a digital receiver. I was in Bridgeport at the time, and I would record certain shows. And then at our weekly staff meeting, we would critique, because that's how I taught the classes. I would critique you, you learn a little bit and you move on. Well, I had a guy cursing and acting silly, and he denied it. And I'm like, I got this on tape. So that became one of my famous suspensions, because I busted him on VCR and he had no idea. They all thought since I didn't live by the radio station, I couldn't catch it. And that they didn't think there was any way I could record it because, I'm busy. Well, yeah, he got a little caught. But we did a lot of good work at CYC. So I don't want to diminish the work that we did as a radio station, but there were times that I had to manage some of the personalities and manage some of the issues that would come up.
Speaking of personalities, there's one guy that, because you had just mentioned about, you had the shout outs and you had the songs, and obviously were the doo-wops and the oldies. And the one guy in particular, Magic Juan.
Magic Juan.
Yes.
I didn't touch Magic Juan. Magic Juan was interesting because Harold Kopta, the founder, who was 68 years old at the time, used to do a polka show on Monday nights, like at 7 o'clock until maybe 9 o'clock.
Okay.
And then Juan would follow up with the Dusty show. And Juan would tell you he kind of had to beg and plead to get that show because Juan's legally blind. And so Harold and Kenny both didn't know how he would be able to do it. And they said, you need to have a producer, but it's an overnight show. So who's going to produce for you? And then you're getting out late at night in an area that's not always wonderful. So Kenny ended up getting a Braille machine, and they brailled a bunch of Juan's stuff. They put it on cart. I would watch Juan work, and I'd see him feel the album covers and feel the labels and feel the grooves. And I'm like, man, this kid is good. But that he ended up with the Monday night thing, but he had to fight for it. And then the Dusty show became one of the better shows, one of the longer running shows, because Juan's collection, talking about Herb Kent earlier, you guys were talking about Herb Kent. Juan had a collection of stuff that other people didn't have. His record crate was a very unique record crate, and there was a lot of Chicago acts that didn't get any breaks, and some national acts, but it was like B-sides and stuff. Juan, I would do the same thing. I'd flip the records every now and then just to see what was on the other side. And Juan was doing this. Juan, he carved a nice little niche for himself.
No, and I remember seeing him over there. This was back in 80, I want to say it was 87, 88.
Yeah, because Juan and I landed at about the same time. We were like a month
Right.
apart landing at WCYC, but I can't take credit for any of the training. He worked with Harold, and he proved himself to Harold, and he proved himself to Kenny, and then he started doing his thing.
Well, I was kind of wondering because I remember then I was working at Malos at the time, and with Jimmy and Johnny talking to them over at Malos, and I says, hey, I think this guy would be great on a Sunday night here. That was a Sunday night that we wanted Magic Juan. And I remember, I had to be there to guide him to, once he got into the DJ booth, he's like, oh, cut out Angelo. Don't worry about me. I'm fine.
Right.
And I would like, okay, but I think I stood there for the first month. And then afterwards I was like, you know what? He's got it.
that was my exact experience. I'd worry about Juan, and there was nothing to worry about. There was one occasion where, remember, we're in a Boys and Girls Club. So they were doing like a Friday night party. and I went, and it was Val Rodriguez and Brian Rodriguez and Gino, whoever was doing the thing downstairs. And I decided to show up to the radio station. I go upstairs to say hi to Juan. There's like 3 people in there watching him, and he didn't know they were there. He's doing his
Right.
show, and I asked him, I said, Juan, do you know who these people are? And he says, oh no, there's somebody here. So I told them that they needed to go downstairs, and they went downstairs, and then I watched them for a little while and let them go. No, WCYC was kind of interesting because they also got close enough, if you've seen the picture, to spray paint Harv Sucks on the wall. So I don't know what I said or did, but I was tagged famously. And it's funny because I came to the station, and it's the front of the building, Harv Sucks, big black spray painted letters. And at first I was like,
What
man,
year was this?
This had to be late 80s, 88, 89 maybe, because I
Okay.
wasn't charged at the time. And my first thing was, man, I got to go to Walgreens and get a disposable camera. This is cool. And so I went to get the disposable camera. I took the pictures that you see online every now and then. And then after I did that, I said, wait a minute, look how close they got to the door, and the door's never locked because, we're letting people in and out and the Boys and Girls Club is running. So then I got a little nervous, and I started thinking about what could it have been that I said or did that caused me to suck in spray paint. But I never really figured it out. The only thing that I could speculate that it was the weekend, like it is right now, Puerto Rican weekend. And of course, I'm Puerto Rican, running a radio station in a little village, which is Mexican, and my top star is a black kid. So I think that maybe I overdid celebrating, the Boricua festival, and maybe that's what offended somebody. I don't know. Maybe I didn't play the request. How many times can you
and then
play?
and then again, there could be a kid just saying "Harv Sucks" just to say it. That
It could.
doesn't.
There's a ring to that. No, we
Yeah.
we we can't play "Let the Night Take the Blame" again. It's like playing Diamond Girl at Studio 63.
Exactly. Or what? Follow me now.
Yeah, Elias. So, but that was the only time that I really was a little worried when they got that close to the door, and I didn't know what happened. There were other times that I would fill in for people that didn't show up, and then I would sleep at the station rather than taking the bus, because are you going to really take a bus on 26th and Ridgeway and head to the Chicago and Damon neighborhood after midnight? No.
No, no,
So
no.
I'd sleep in the studio. That's how I discovered other people were also sleeping in the studio, and they had nothing to do with the radio station. I went in there one morning, and I saw 2 pairs of legs sticking out from the spare studio, and I stepped over them, and I said, no, I didn't just see that. So then I went to the washroom. I came back, and they were still there. So I had to wake them up and ask them to leave, and I will never know who they were, because they were not radio station kids. They might have been club kids. I don't know. I don't know. But it was interesting. It was an interesting experience.
So, and since you mentioned club kids, let's talk about that. When did you start getting that concept of the club kids for you, for your, as far as was it just because people were hanging out there, or was it because they were asking you now to host events, or
Well,
what?
it's funny because some people think I came up with club kids because of the clubs, Studio 63, Prime Intender, whatever. And I'm like, no, because the kids we're teaching are from the Boys and Girls Club in Little Village. And then when I started teaching radio classes on my side at the Union League Boys and Girls Club, again,
Okay.
there were kids with the Boys and Girls Clubs. And when I took the show over to Loyola University, they're kids from the club. So I think a lot of people thought I was saying club kids because of the club business, and it wasn't. It
Right.
was because we started teaching the kids from the Boys and Girls Club, and I kind of stuck to that. Eventually, there were some adults that I was teaching, but I had a cutoff. I wasn't teaching a lot of adults. I figured it's club kids, so we're doing club kids. WCYC at the time was half Spanish, and they had like 30-year-olds broadcasting, and here I am with 14 and 15-year-olds. So that was kind of interesting. But club kids was basically because they were members of the Boys and Girls Club, not because they were out
Okay.
clubbing.
All right. So I'm glad I asked that question. Because I heard you say it so many times, and I'm thinking, okay, what club is this? Or that's why I was wondering. Um, where do you consider the highlight of this the CYC aspect of it? What do you consider the pinnacle of where you went with this in CYC?
Well, I always liked the idea that we were considered the ones who discovered freestyle or played freestyle for the masses, to the point where when George Lamont came out with his first album, and it's funny, he came out with a 12-inch first, and he autographs my 12-inch, and he says, "You definitely earned your place on my album credits." And I'm like, whatever. So all of a sudden it comes out on cassette first, and it's at Hot Jams, and I'm buying the cassette, and I unravel it as I'm on the bus stop, and I'm like, holy moly, he listed me in the album credits. He really did. And that was only the first. There were several others that listed me in the album credits. We got a lot of respect from the artists for playing their music, but it wasn't just that we were playing the music. We talked about it earlier. We were giving them a platform to interview, and if they were not in studio interviewing, they were on the phone interviewing. And then I eventually hosted so many events that I got to know them just because I'm hosting events, and we're having, at the time, we used to have hotel parties afterwards. You go to the hotel and hang out, and we ended up becoming personal friends. And I was programming the music, it's true, but it almost became, we're all friends, we're gonna play what happens. And so whatever Cynthia came out with, I'm gonna play it. Whatever George comes out with, I'm gonna play. Whatever Judy comes out with, I'm gonna play. And I looked at it as I was supporting the artist more than I was supporting the genre. And there was some stuff, that came out that really wasn't great, but I was gonna play it anyway. Metropolitan, for every April song that was a hit, you get a song that you're like, what the heck are they doing over there? But you still want to play it and expose it. And then my hope is that the listener will determine if it's worth playing again. So we played a lot of music that other people didn't play, just to give it a foot in the door. And then if the listeners responded, great. And if the listeners didn't respond, so be it. And then, of course, our base was always Chicago artists anyway, be it house music or freestyle music or hip house eventually. When Chicago plays Chicago, that's when we're at our strongest form, in my opinion. To this day, I think it should still be that way. But back then, they weren't getting as much respect as they needed. I mean, interview some of these groups from Chicago, and they'll tell you they were better received in New York than in Chicago, which is insane. You're from Chicago, and you have to go to New York to get respect, or you have to go somewhere else to get paid, because here you're a promoter, so you know what the game is. There was always, there was the hooker brother up fee. There was the hookup contracts where you kind of were doing it as a favor, because I think, what was Al's big thing? We're giving you promotion, which was nice, but it's tough to be a Chicago artist who's working for promo, and that the other acts are not working for promo. What they're getting paid. I knew what they were getting paid because I was friends with Chris Barbosa, who was managing George. I was friends with Salabatello, who was managing everybody. And I knew what they were getting paid. I was getting breaks on them, but I knew what they were getting paid. And then you wind up having Chicago acts that were being told, well, if you do this, you're going to get so much publicity out of it. And it was bad for them. These were the same acts that would sign contracts that they were paying off album covers. They're paying off studio time. They're paying off video shoots before they ever saw any money. So if they weren't doing any shows, they weren't making any money because, well, you're in the business. You probably heard the same thing. You get Tyree with this really cool album cover. Well, guess who pays for it? It was Chicago was rough on Chicago artists. It was and they all would say the same thing. And in some cases, they would say it on the air. They would say it on the air. And maybe I wasn't always popular for giving them the format, but you can't. And then, of course, a lot of them were getting signed before they were even 18. So the contracts weren't legal, but the labels weren't going to say this ain't legal. They're going to hold them to the contract and then 5 years later, maybe the kid gets a better contract. Chicago wasn't always nice to the Chicago acts. That's why sometimes they'll tell you they would rather get booked somewhere else because they knew they were going to get paid. They knew they were going to get respected. And That was just kind of the way it was. And
Well,
with radio, it was kind of an interesting game too, because there were certain DJs that might play certain artists or certain labels, but they wouldn't play everybody. They wouldn't give everybody a break. So once again, Chicago acts are losing because you're not connected to the right label or the right DJ. I love Chicago. Chicago wasn't always pretty when it came to the acts.
well, you have been in the business for quite a long time, and I'm going to relate to something that I witnessed when I was the floor master and I was breakdancing. I had 125 members that were part of that were there at the Boys Club over
It's
there.
like, it's like West Side Story on
Yes,
19th and
yes,
Levitt.
correct. But you were handling a lot more people on 26th Street, meaning kids and so forth. One of the greatest things that I had to this day is when I have one of the members come up to me and tell me that I saved their life, basically because I got them out of the gang situation, stuff like that. Do you get that from people from the club kids that you dealt with through your tenure of your?
I do. I get that occasionally with some of the kids that I worked with at WCYC. The WCYC thing was basically part-time, and it wasn't always paid. My full-time gig was with the Union League Boys and Girls Clubs, where you would hang on 19th and Levitt. We had a sister club at 524 North Walcott, and that's where I was full-time forever. And then I ran my own club in Humboldt Park. And a lot of times those kids will come to you. And it's funny because I would tell the staff, they're not going to tell you now, but when they're 30, 35, when they have their own kids and they bring the kids to you to say, this guy made a difference. If it wasn't for this guy, it does. It happens I've screen grabbed so many of these things where they talk about if it wasn't for what we did for them. And with me, whatever I did, it was natural. It wasn't like I said, I'm going to save this kid. It was,
Right.
I'm going to work on their leadership skills. I'm going to give them some attention. I'm going to give them some opportunity, but I didn't look at it and say, well, if I don't do this, they're going to be lost. There was the occasional kid that I would recruit because I felt like there might be trouble for them if they didn't. And then I had occasional good kids that were just, I would recruit them into my leadership programs. And there was one girl in particular, she passed away too, unfortunately, but she became a school teacher. But when she was like 14, I'm like, this little girl's got some leadership in her. How can I get her to use it, to help develop herself? And so I had a leadership group. She used to hang out in the computer room all the time. She was really into computers. I started having my leadership meetings in the computer room just to attract her. And eventually I did. And she became one of our Youth of the Year, and she became a school teacher. And unfortunately, she was killed a few years ago. But that was a pretty nice story of you see something in somebody, and then you want to develop it. Gino's another good story. You're the 14-year-old, Val brings you in as a mixer from the DJ classes. He gets upstairs to me, and I'm thinking the same thing. This kid's got a personality. Why can't he do mic work as well as mix work? And then he ended up having a really popular show working the mic. And who would have thunk? And that happened on a few occasions where you give people opportunity. And then some people like Rick Party was naturally good.
The
Michelle,
opportunity to shine.
yeah, Candy Gomez, she got in. I think she was 14, and she just was good. You're just teaching them maybe to work on their personality skills and their presentation skills. She was good. She came in through Kenny, not through me. She somehow got in through Kenny. Eventually she wound up in my classes because I was doing the classes, but there's some people that you really don't need to teach. You just give them the opportunity. And then once they go through 3 months worth of whatever, you wind up on the air. And we wound up with a nice track record of people that did well outside of us, and even if they didn't make it in traditional radio, they become business people. They become, the renowned dentist in Brighton Park, and a lot of times they would say that whether or not they ended up on the radio in real life wasn't important, but the classes taught them how to communicate. The classes gives them confidence. The classes teach them how to speak well, how to be respected. And that's nice to hear too. Every now and then you get that, and it's kind of nice. I pretend that it doesn't humble me, but it does.
Right, right. And that's why I mentioned it, because I remember that I was I was 15 years old, 16 years old, and here I had 125 members. So, I was 16 years old. What do I know? All I know is I'm having fun, and bringing all these kids together. But I think I realized it was after I stopped breakdancing, and then it was seeing these guys come 21, 22, and they remember me, and they says, "Oh yeah, I remember we used to breakdance with you." And I think, like you said, when they had their kids, that was the first mention of it. Or I remember you when I was 13, 14 years old, you gave me a shot.
Oh, you wind up becoming some sort of lifesaver. Imagine if Troy Winston didn't become like the lead in imported taste. Imagine if Jose Gringo didn't do all-star dancers back then. That was how they expressed themselves. That's how they were respected. And in the traditional sense, they were probably outsiders in the social circles back then. Now, I went to high school with Troy. Troy was accepted in high school from day one, but Troy was Troy. He was a different type of personality. He might not have gotten the breaks and respect, but he did. And that was more because, man, that kid could dance. And Gringo was the same way. And then he had followers. And then all of a sudden you got all-star dancers and colito dancers and floor masters. I'll always remember the floor masters because, of course, Club One was part of our clique. You were Club One, we were Club Two. And we were told floor masters are going to be on AM Chicago. It wasn't even the Oprah show yet. It was AM Chicago with Rob Weller and Oprah Winfrey, some woman nobody ever heard of. And we're watching, and I think you guys had like satin, like baseball style jackets or something weird like that.
Yes,
Back
yes.
then it wasn't weird, but we all thought it was cool because you were club kids. Of course, you were club kids from Pilsen, and we were the club kids from over here. But Union League was Union League, and we were proud, and we were watching, and it probably was a 19-inch black and white TV, but there you guys were. I think the sad part was that I don't think VCRs were even invented yet. So
it was beta. It was recorded on beta.
Yeah, I was gonna say, to try to have anything where like you could YouTube AM Chicago from 1983. A lot of that history it's in the mind, and it might be in the book that Jose wrote, but it's just stories. And they'll look, oh come on, Angelo, you're always telling stories. That didn't happen. No, it did happen. It's like Paulo's talking about putting up posters back in the day. That happened too. And then somebody was right behind you ripping them down because it was that was the competing promoter. You put it up, somebody rips it down, and that happened. Well, no, I take that back. That didn't happen to us. We happened to it back when there was a big old banner. And Fast Forward was on the banner, was on 26th and Kedzie. And we were driving around at the time. It was WCYC country, like I called it. And I'm with Nelson, and Nelson sees the banner. And this was for them, I think, at the Aragon Ballroom or something like that. And Nelson says, I got to have that. And I'm like, well, no, that's like Pinky's. And Nelson scaled the light pole, and he took down the banner. This is 26th and Kedzie. I don't know what time it was. I don't remember if it was before an event or after an event. But I've got a picture of them on the roof of my Boys and Girls Club, and they're posing with the banner that they took down from 26 and Kedzie in the middle of the night or middle of whatever it was. That was a precious commodity. But back in the poster flyer days, Paulo was saying that he didn't want to get into going out anymore and doing flyers, man. I remember, I was booking Tony Boom Boom Bidet at the time before he was even Boom Boom. And he was part of the mobile unit that we had called Magic Mixers. And I would get him booked initially through with Charlie from Party People. And part of the deal was I'm sitting there outside of Nancy's Pizza putting pluggers on the windshields of these cars while Tony's inside spinning, like the 7 o'clock hour in the beginning, because whatever you got to do, your name's on the plugger, you're a happy guy. And we've come a long way since putting flyers on windshields. It's crazy.
Well, I wonder because of this pandemic if that's what's going to have to happen again because we you know, even though Facebook is what it is, I wonder if, you know, Facebook is not going to be as reliable because now you got to go get to people now because there's so little people out there, you know.
I don't know what's going to happen when it comes to getting together, because you're right. You've got social spacing needs. We don't know how long this is going to last or when it's going to go away. If you're going to slow dance, are you supposed to be 6 feet apart doing a slow jam? It's I don't know. Like, you're playing Always and Forever and you're like shadow dancing because we can't be all over each other.
Right. So
It's a very interesting, crazy time right now. You know, we were dealing with this and then stuff that was happening, stuff that was always happening that we knew it was happening is now finally coming to light. You know, like yesterday, I was at a rally for Black Lives Matters, and it's 2020, and I'm glad it's being addressed. But I think people are forgetting that this stuff was happening. I remember the Leonard Clark when I lived in Bridgeport. Leonard Clark was the kid that got picked up by the police and dropped off in Bridgeport. And this is a black kid getting dropped, and they dropped him off in Bridgeport. They knew what was going to happen, and it happened. And it was on the news for a minute, and then it went away. And I love the Chicago police. At that time, that was one of their tactics. If they grabbed you, they put you off, they drop you in somebody else's territory, and you know, we're going to teach you a lesson.
It wasn't just black kids. They did that with Latinos too. They caught them over there on Kedzie and 26, and they would drop them off on Kenville and 26. You know, they would drop them off in the opposing gang. That's
what they would do. That's what they would do. My introduction to 26th Street was interesting because I would take the bus from where I was at on the north side. And to me, 26th Street, like every corner seemed to represent a different gang. It was like nobody ran like the whole strip. It was, okay, on this corner is this gang, on that corner is that gang. But I will tell you though, people like Magic Juan, again, legally blind, he would be taking the bus. He would have his record crate. He'd be on foot, never got bothered. I would be traveling on the bus manually, however, and I never got bothered. It's almost as if you were a DJ, they'd leave you alone. It was interesting, but we didn't get bothered. The ones that got bothered were the ones that supposedly ran with the gangs, and all of a sudden you're this certain gang's DJ, so they're gonna bother you. But
no, I remember that was me at 14, 15 when I started DJing. I ended up moving by my dad's house on 25th and Oakley, and everybody kind of knew that I grew up with freshman year of high school. Oh, Angelo's a DJ. So now you come back in the neighborhood, and I used to come back in the neighborhood every so often, and they would say, "Hey, we heard you're DJing now," and you it was kind of the cloak that you were wearing now, because now you're not a threat to anybody. You're everybody's friend. And well, obviously
that was a whole nother border. Like on Western Avenue towards the jail, that was one situation. And on Western Avenue heading towards downtown, there was another situation. Chicago stinks that way. Like you know which viaduct, you know which street corner, you already know, what to expect and what you're in for. And they weren't too proud to let you know whether you belonged or whether you didn't belong. And it kind of, I hated it. I still do.
Well, yeah, and that's, but and I think me and you had talked about this. What I remember, I was young, but I also remember this because my dad was a police officer during the Puerto Rican riots, and I was talking about that during the Puerto Rican riot. That was like 76, 77, and I remember. And the reason why I remember, I was young, I was a kid. And I just remember my dad's squad car had the tapes on the windshield wipers and excuse me, on the windows and everything like that. And he had the old time riot gear, the blue helmet with the shield and stuff like that. And I just remember that it was very, um, you couldn't go by Humboldt Park. It was, they had turned over the cars and it was just crazy. But if I'm mistaken, I think me and you talked about it. Immediately after that is when I think the Puerto Rican community came together, and then all of a sudden there was some salsa music or salsa bands coming out in the scene, and that was 77, 78.
Well, when I was at Wells, which started in '77, we had and Gringo would know this. We had a band called Tipicaliel 78 performed. They became a lot bigger, but back then they were just starting. And you're right. Eventually there was a sense of pride. Whether it started with the riots, who knows? But the riots became, and we saw it on the news. What's happening,
Mm-hmm.
and we're like, man, what's going on in Humboldt Park? Um, it's a shame, that cop cars are getting flipped over and burned and whatever, just like in the late '60s. But it also seemed to unify everybody. And I took over running that Boys and Girls Club in 2002. And I'm telling you, the community still is not always excited about the Chicago Police Department. It's as if the stories have been handed down from generation to generation, and they still have this feeling that they weren't being respected, be it because they were from the Bickerdikes or from the hood or whatever. But the roots were probably planted in '77 with these so-called riots, and I do remember it was horrible because that makes us, look as, well, I say it makes us look bad, but it allowed everyone to kind of judge Puerto Ricans based on what they saw in the news, and
Right.
that wasn't cool because it's not all of us. It's like when the bombings were happening back in the day. Well, these are the Puerto Ricans doing it, so you end up getting judged for what other people are doing, and it took a while, for us to get our respect and kind of get over the perceptions that people have of us. It was bad. When I took over the club, I used to tell the staff and the kids this: there are certain people that are going to expect something from you, and so we have to flip it. They're judging you by what's being spray painted on the walls. They're judging you by what's happening between the steel flags. And so we have to change it from within our walls. And then my challenge to them was to kind of get the respect back when it came to the Boys and Girls Club, and then go back into the community and prove yourself as a leader rather than all these other things. Because when I took over that club, I remember going to a CAPS meeting and being told that it was a particular gangs club. And I'm like, no, it's the Union League Boys and Girls Club. No, that's this gangs club, and they do this and they do that. And it turned out that I inherited a club that had a horrible reputation with the police department and a wonderful reputation with some of the gangs, which is probably not a good combination. And I had to flip it with the staff, and I wasn't always popular because of it. Some of the decisions I made ended up closing the doors on like the alumni program, and but the alumni at the time they were not wearing coats and ties; they were wearing something else, and I was confronted a couple of times because I killed the alumni program. But I'm like, no, because if I'm trying to build it from the ground up, and this 6-year-old is walking in the halls, and these big muscly tattoo guys who were hanging in the corner a minute ago are in the weight room doing their thing, and I just couldn't. And like I say, I wasn't popular for a little while. Eventually, I had some of those guys come up to me and thank me for what I did in terms of the changing the atmosphere of the Boys and Girls Club. And I remember this one well-known gangbanger at the time comes and he thanks me, and he says, because I'm sending my nieces there, I'm sending my nephews there, I'm sending my cousins there. I couldn't send them there if all this was happening. And I remember thinking the same thing when the 14th district told me what our reputation was. I said, well, this is horrible, because if they know at a certain time and a certain day that a certain gang is playing ball, what's to stop the opposing gang from coming by, on basketball night? So I made decisions because I wanted it to be safe. I made decisions because I wanted to go back to being a Boys and Girls Club. And fortunately, I was able to flip it, and it wasn't just me. You know, I had a whole staff to work with and develop.
Correct.
I they did not all. I had one program director who shall remain nameless. Somebody else was nameless, and he would call me Mr. Rogers. You're just Mr. Rogers. You think everything's going to be wonderful, and he didn't think that I should have treated the members with the respect that I treated them with, because again, some of them are gangbangers. And I said, well, I'm going to respect them until they disrespect me. As long as they give me respect, I'm going to give them respect, because you can't sit there in denial and say that you don't have gangbangers in your building. And I had people that wanted me to push it like that. Oh no, gangs don't come to the Boys and Girls Club. I'm like, come on, they're next door. You're telling me they don't know? They come, they use the building. They're not wearing their colors. They're not representing. They're using us to play ball. They're using us to shoot pool. They're using us to work in the weight room. They're not wearing their colors. They're not open chested so you can see the tattoo. And to me, and then in return, it was an unofficial agreement. Our building never got tagged, and everybody knew that the club was neutral. So there were no issues. And you can't say that about all these youth programs, these youth agencies. You'll see a building tagged and there's kids coming in and out of there. That didn't happen with us. And I'm not saying that I'm some magical genius, but I figured out a way to respect our next door neighbors who happen to be gangbangers and be able to run a Boys and Girls Club and use it for the good of the community. And I offended some, but I offended them for the right reasons. And I remember there was one kid in particular. He was not happy with me, and I had to suspend him. He's a teenager, and he's outside the windows, and he's representing, and he's telling me what he's going to do to me. And so I walked out and I said, listen, at 9 o'clock, I'm going to walk down Western Avenue till I get to Damon. When I get to Damon, I'm going to walk until I get to this street and that street. I said, if you have to do something, just do what you got to do. And like the next day, he apologizes. He says, I didn't mean it. It's just you punked me out, because you know how the tough guys are if you punk them out. So he thought I punked him out in front of his boys, and all I was doing was enforcing rules. But if they're going to do something, what are you going to do? So I figured, all right, 9 o'clock, I get to walk home, and this is my route. I wasn't going about it. I wouldn't have done the side streets anyway, because, Humboldt Park wasn't a joke at one time.
No. Well, I mean, the reason why I brought up the whole thing about the salsa band in '78 was because that was probably when I seen the community come together, and music kind of brought people together.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
And I think that's what is probably going to happen. That needs to happen now, because not to say the music is the answer to it all. I think music is a soothing aspect. Dance is a soothing aspect. We all go through this. We're all going through this situation now, and just like you said about Troy, he was a phenomenal dancer and stuff like that. And he brought people together, and that's how he created, the All Stars and Gringo and Radar and all these guys. And me, the Floor Masters. It was all about bringing people together, and that's what we did. We brought people together through music and dance. And I believe that you, me, George Ortega, all these guys who have done this, we have kind of Al Cisneros, Pablo. I think this is, we kind of have that, and if you watched, I really enjoyed what George Ortega said, because we as promoters / we're kind of a community activist in a sense.
Well, and it helped me that I had a Boys and Girls Club background. It helped me that I had a youth development background. So I didn't have to go. The director before me, he thought he had to confront these guys. He thought he had to act like them. He had to talk like them. And then they told me, about a fight that he had with one of the top gangbangers who lived next door, because he felt like he had to prove himself. And I'm like, no. I said, how hard could it be to give them respect? you know. And I used to say this all the time. I would go to my headquarters downtown. I say, if there's such a thing as a respectful relationship with the gangs, that's what we have. They would let us know if something happened during the weekend. They would let us know if
Right.
there was going to be retaliation at a certain time. And then I would tell the staff, I would tell the members, hey, listen, after 6 o'clock, you know, I'm gonna put the club in lockdown because I was told this is gonna happen. And then sure enough, stuff would happen. But it wouldn't happen in my building or around my building. But you didn't want to encourage people to walk home knowing that something crazy was going to happen. And you're right, music is a really good and it was interesting because it's June right now, you know, June 7th. So it would have been parade season, it would have been carnival season right now. And for the most part, you could go to the carnival, you could go to a parade, you could hang out at the Boricua Festival up and down Division Street, knowing that it was all about the music and there weren't going to be any issues. Now, there was a qualifier. After a certain time, you probably didn't want to be around, because after a certain time, I think they would get tired of behaving, and then, you know, something was going to happen. But for the most part, Angelo, the music was unifying everybody. And it
Correct.
took like an all day event where people were drinking that maybe made guys feel a little bit more territorial towards the end of it. But we knew. I would take my son when he was a little boy and his mom, and then I would always say, come 6 o'clock, we gotta go. Like, we knew already. And yeah,
Right.
stuff happened. It wasn't always happening to the moms and the dads and the kids. They knew who they were looking for, and then there would be an issue, and it would be a shame. It stinks that Chicago was like that and Humboldt Park was like that. But Humboldt Park in particular it really is a family-based community, you know. And it's
Right. Right.
but it's either going to be a traditional family, or it's going to be a family that adopts you. And sometimes
Right.
the family that's adopted you is not it's not always the proper role models. I did a training in New York once, and this guy in New York announces to the whole room, he says, there are no gangs in New York. And then we're going, ooh, ah, ooh. And he goes, there are negative youth groups. So they label them negative youth groups, and they intentionally didn't want to use the word gangs because they didn't want these people to think that they were, you know, being pigeonholed into this, that, or the other. I did it the opposite when I worked in Humboldt Park. I said, yeah, we got gangs. They don't bother us. They don't mess with us. But, you know, and then there's always the times too where there's release dates, and it seems like everybody gets released at the same time from prison, and then they end up back in the neighborhood. But then we would get the word, and then we'd have to be on our toes a little bit because something was going to happen.
Right. Right.
It's just the way it was. But I tried to keep the club community informed, and I always tried to maintain respect. And my style wasn't for everybody because they thought that I should be this big, hard, tough guy. Every now and then I was, but it's not. You know, to me, it's always going to be about respect. And then if we were disrespected, then we had to deal with it. We just had to work with that. I'll tell you, Angelo, for some of these kids, I don't think they were respected by adults before. They'd freak out that you're treating them with respect. They freak out if you're looking at them in the eye when you're talking to them, because in their homes, if the adult's looking at you in the eye, you need to look down and just listen and respect. And I'm talking to these kids, and I'm looking in the air, and they're looking down. And I had one kid, and I asked the kid, I literally said, do you have trouble looking me in the eye? And he says, my daddy doesn't let me look him in the eye. And I was like, oh, okay, well, as long as you're listening, I'm not going to make you look at me in the eye. And up until that point, I'm telling the kids, look at me, listen to me. And it turns out in some cultures, that's just not happening. In some families, that's just not
Right.
happening. And you kind of have to learn what some of these boundaries are with some of these families, because it's not all the same. You know, we like to joke about chancleta justice and the correa and stuff like that. But, you know, if that were the case,
I
how
think we'll be
many
all
yeah, how many of our parents would be in trouble right now for what they're doing? And
we'll be great. Everybody.
and my son's 34 now, and I think the last time I swatted him, he might have been 3 or 4. I developed a strategy early on with the lectures and the talking, and he hated it.
Right.
His mother wasn't the lecture talking lady, so she'd be upset and he knew it, but it would be over like that. And I'd be upset and he knew it, and it would never end. And he literally told me he would rather that his mother took care of the business than I, because when she took care of the business, it was over fast. And when I took care of the business, it never ended. He's like, are we done talking yet? Okay, I learned. It was funny, but I joke around and I call it chancleta justice, but that's, the old school. That's how you learn. That's how we were taught on the island. And so they brought that over here, and it's not politically correct and it's not the healthiest thing to do, but who am I to tell mom or pop that how they handled things didn't work when I turned out okay.
Right. I agree.
When it came time to raising my own son, I said, that's what I'm not going to do. But I'm never going to say mom or pop are bad at what they did, because I turned out okay.
Yeah, so exactly.
It hurts sometimes, but I turned out okay.
Right. Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour.
Boy, did we talk about everything? We remember that cheat sheet? Did we cover all that stuff? Probably not, right?
There's a lot to talk about. Are there anything that you want to tell the guests that have tuned in, as far as anything with you?
Were there any questions from them that popped up?
No. I mean, I didn't do what Castillo did. I didn't do that, where people would call. But I think I wanted people to pretty much know your history. That's what really what this interview was about. I know you've touched a lot of people's their history. You created a lot of history for a lot of people, and I think that's the most important thing in people knowing about you, Harv. Obviously, I know you've done tremendous amount of hosting and events and stuff like that. You've done
Well, it's an interesting history, because on one side of the town, I was the youth development guy, I was the leadership guy, I was the Boys and Girls Club guy. And on the other side of town, I was the hosting guy, and I was the radio guy, and I was the interview guy. And I remember, you go back to the early 90s, and George Lopez or John Leguizamo or George Lamond or some of these acts would be coming in, and I'd be dealing with them on the interview side. And then I'd invite them to the Boys and Girls Club. And these people, how do you know that man? How do you know? And I would try to tell them I was on the radio, and they didn't believe me, because back then you couldn't get 90.5 FM on the north side. It was it was interesting, but to me it was always about setting an example. It was always about helping to promote, whatever the positive values are, and then bringing allowing the acts, allowing the comics, allowing the singers, allowing the dancers to have a format. Heck, I would interview the dancers. I'd interview Kenny and Eddie, George's dancers, and I'd interview Carlos and Wilson, Cynthia's dancers, and they'd freak out. Say, why do you want to interview us? And I'm like, why not? It's interesting. Everybody has heard a Lamond interview, or everybody has heard a Cynthia interview. You guys are on stage, you're putting on a show. Why not talk about what you do? And so there was always, in my ways, there was always a different twist, because you're competing with a B96, for instance. So if you do what they're doing, it's not going to work. You're 90.5. Even when I went to the AM shows at 1450 or 1690, you still have to be wrapped in aluminum or whatever to get the radio station. So we needed to do what the big boys were not doing. And I think ultimately that's why you're talking to me, 30 some years later, and I was at a radio station where your cell phone probably has more wattage than that station did at the time. And it worked out well. And I think my background in youth development and community work helped me, because I didn't have an attitude. It was just about developing people. And so go ahead. And you,
well, I was going to say, I think
but you froze for a minute, so I don't know what happened.
Okay, go ahead.
But I was going to say, and you're kind of you're a different part of the equation, because I really don't know how you saw me, be it the club guy or the radio guy, because when we had a relationship back then, you're promoting, so you're donating tickets to be given away on the radio. So I knew you as a promoter, but that's all I really knew. Okay, well, he promotes and we're giving away the tickets. And if we see each other, we handshake. We don't do elbow bumps like they do now.
Right,
But
right, right.
I didn't know how. I kind of don't really know how you came to see me or about me. Who knows? But
Well, just the relationships I had with everybody that knew you. I was somehow I was working with everybody. That was the best part for me. I was working with everybody. South
oh,
side, north side, or anything like that. That was.
I know it's running late, but if I don't say this, I'm gonna want to knock myself in the head. It's been interesting to watch you do these interviews, and it's been maybe 2.5 months, 3 months, and I'm watching because I'm interested. But it seems as if, I don't want to say 100%, but I'm telling you, about 90.5% of your interviews, they wind up talking about WCYC, which is so trippy to me because, again, at the time, you're just doing what you think is right. You're doing what you can for the community, but you're not thinking about 30 years from now, somebody's going to flash back to this little radio station that nobody realized how tiny we really were. There were times that Kenny would go in with a screwdriver, open up the transmitter, and twist the screw to boost the wattage. It was crazy. But a lot of the guys that you've interviewed have talked about WCYC and the impact, and that's kind of it is a humbling experience of listening to these guys, and then they talk about whatever WCYC meant to them and as DJs or as a community. It's I wouldn't have thought that. I really wouldn't have.
Well, that speaks numbers for you, Harv. That speaks numbers for you because you are a big part of that and a big part of everybody's, especially in the DJ's lives and in the history of our lives. You are a big part of it, and coming from everybody that's listening and anybody that watches this, I want to say personally, thank you for everything you've done for this industry, everything you've done for just the education with kids, and thank you for everything that you have and more stuff that you're going to accomplish with everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you for the respect, and thank you for thinking that would be an interesting interview, because I remember we were trading notes. I'm like, what are we going to talk about? I mean, a lot of times it becomes, let's talk about all these artists and what they're really like. But
I didn't hear. It was you. Yeah, so that's what I want to make sure.
That's what it turned into. So everybody's secrets are still safe. Still safe.
We won't mention names, okay?
No, well, I'll mention on a closing note. You asked about a highlight, and
Okay.
I remember when we did an event at the Oak Theater with Judy Torres, and this is probably 1993, and the event at the Oak Theater was a makeup for an event that was canceled at Studio 63 at the time, Prime and Tender. So.
Okay.
She goes on the mic at the Oak Theater, which is on the north side, and she says, listen, I'm sorry. I'm telling you what, I'm gonna go do an interview at Harv Roman's show tomorrow between this time and that time. And if you go over there, you can take pictures with me and I'll sign autographs and we'll just have a good time, whatever she said. And
Right.
I didn't think anything about it. So we're doing the interview, and then somebody tells me that the hallway is filled with people that want to meet Judy. And she cut the interview short. It wasn't even 5 minutes. She says, I got to go see my people. And I'm telling you, I don't know if you had ever been to CYC back then,
Yeah.
but from the studio door all the way down the hallway and down the stairs, there's people that because she said, come see me, they went to go see her. We
Right.
didn't finish the interview. But she stuck around and she met and greeted everybody. And I'm like, the power of Judy Torres, this is crazy. But back then, that's you know what, that's the power of of a community radio station that people underestimate, because you can't personally collect to the major radio stations. they don't really know you. And if you call in for what a request, they might play it if it happens to be on the playlist. But CYC back then, you could actually make a request and get it played because, you know, we could do that.
Right.
And with the relationship with the artist, that's probably the best story that I can think of is her. She says, "Come by," and they came by, and it was innocent. It was fun. There was no trouble. And maybe that's what freestyle is all about, right? It's supposed to be love. It's not supposed to be
Right.
drama.
Exactly. All right, Harv, that is it for our show. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Harv.
Oh, thanks for the invite. And for anybody who happened to tune in, thank you all for paying attention or maybe not paying attention to what I've been saying for the last hour and a half. Thanks again, Angelo. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.